The dust was a covenant, a promise the land made to the sky and kept with every gust of wind. Elias Thorne knew its taste, the fine grit that coated his tongue and settled in the deep lines around his eyes. His ranch was an island in a sea of ochre and sagebrush, a lonely testament to stubbornness carved into the unforgiving flesh of the West. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the shingles of his small cabin, on the weathered wood of the corral, on the stooped shoulders of the man himself as he mended a split-rail fence. Each movement was deliberate, economical, honed by years of solitude. He worked not with haste, but with a rhythm that matched the slow, ponderous breath of the landscape. Inside him the silence was vaster than the plains, a hollowed-out space where a family's laughter once echoed before fire had turned it all to ash and memory. He didn't think of them, not with words, but they were there, in the way he held his tools, a phantom weight in his hands, a constant low hum of absence beneath the whistle of the wind through the eaves. He was a man of few words because words were for sharing, and he had no one left to share them with. His world had been reduced to the essentials, the thirst of the earth, the needs of his few cattle, the rise and fall of the relentless sun. It was a simple, brutal existence, and he had grown to fit its contours like a river shaping its bed, deep and quiet, and carrying a current of sorrow that ran all the way to the sea. He finished his work, the new wood a pale scar against the old, and looked west. The sun was bleeding into the horizon, painting the clouds in violent strokes of orange and purple. It was the time of day when the loneliness was sharpest, a knife's edge against the heart. He had sent a letter weeks ago, a desperate, clumsy reach for something other than this emptiness. A mail-order bride, the words felt foreign in his mind, a gamble against the crushing certainty of his grief. He expected nothing, which was the only way to guard against the inevitable pain of disappointment. The letter had been a concession to the gnawing quiet, a foolish hope planted in the barren soil of his life. It promised a woman named Annabelle, described in neat clerical script as pious and of good stock, a companion to temper the harsh edges of his existence. He didn't crave piety. He craved the simple sound of another human being breathing in the next room, a presence to push back against the ghosts that haunted the long, dark hours of the night. So he had ridden into the town of redemption, a place that had long ago forgotten the meaning of its own name. It was a clot of wood and dust on the artery of the plains, a place of hard-bitten men and women whose gazes were as flat and unforgiving as the landscape itself. He tied his horse, the creak of the leather a familiar sound in the tense quiet of the main street. The stagecoach was due, and a small, resentful crowd had gathered near the mercantile, their faces pinched with the kind of cruel curiosity that festers in small, isolated communities. Elias felt their eyes on him, the solitary rancher from Blackstone Ridge, the man who had lost everything. He ignored them, his focus on the horizon, on the dust cloud that would signal the coach's arrival. The air was thick with more than dust, it was heavy with judgment, with the unspoken histories and petty grievances that bound the townsfolk together in a web of shared suspicion. He stood apart from them, a rock in the current, his stoicism a shield against their prying thoughts. He was not one of them. His tragedy had set him apart, and his solitude had kept him there. He waited, his hands still, his jaw set, a man braced for a delivery that felt less like a new beginning and more like the arrival of a stranger who would only serve to highlight the depths of his own desolation. He didn't want a wife. He wanted an anchor, something to stop him from drifting away entirely into the great, silent emptiness that threatened to consume him. The stagecoach arrived in a flurry of dust and exhausted horseflesh, the driver's curses cutting through the thick afternoon air. The townsfolk leaned forward, a collective intake of breath. The door swung open, but it was not the pious Annabelle who emerged. Instead, a woman stumbled out, her dress torn at the shoulder, her dark hair a wild tangle around a face pale with shock and exhaustion. She wasn't a name from a letter. She was a raw, open wound. She stood there, blinking in the harsh sunlight, her eyes wide and haunted, like a doe caught in the hunter's sights. She clutched a small, worn satchel to her chest, as if it were the last piece of a shipwreck. There was a brand on her wrist, a cruel, dark mark that some of the women in the crowd noticed with a shared, vicious glance. Before Elias could process the discrepancy, Before he could form a single question, Reverend Blackwood stepped forward from the crowd. He was a man whose piety was a weapon, his face a mask of self-righteous fury. "Harlot," he boomed, his voice cracking like a whip, "you dare show your face in this decent town? You were cast out for your sins, for the abomination you carry." The woman flinched as if struck, her body curling inward, trying to make itself smaller, to disappear. The crowd murmured, the sound a low, hungry growl. They smelled weakness, a target for the venom of their own small, unhappy lives. They saw not a person but a symbol, a scapegoat upon whom they could pour their fear and their judgment. Elias watched, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. He saw her trembling, the profound, gut-wrenching terror in her eyes, and something inside him, something long dormant and buried under layers of grief, stirred. It was the instinct of a man who had seen too much suffering, who knew the look of a soul cornered by the world. The Reverend's voice rose, each word a stone cast at the defenseless woman. "She is a blight, a Jezebel sent to poison our community. She bears the mark of her transgressions for all to see." He pointed a long, bony finger at her, and the crowd surged with a low, menacing energy. The woman's breath came in ragged, silent gasps. She looked around, her eyes darting from one hostile face to another, finding no quarter, no kindness, only a wall of condemnation. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Elias felt the familiar weight of loss, the ghost of his wife's hand in his, the echo of his daughter's cry. He had failed to protect them from the indiscriminate cruelty of fate, from the fire that had consumed his world. He had stood by, helpless, as everything he loved turned to smoke. Now, watching this stranger being torn apart by the pack, that old bitter feeling of powerlessness rose in his throat like bile. The world was a place of fire and predators, and innocence was the first thing to burn. He saw the townsfolk for what they were, not righteous, but afraid. They were afraid of anything that was different, anything that reminded them of their own fragility, their own secret sin. And so they found the weakest among them and called her a monster to make themselves feel like saints. A muscle twitched in Elias's jaw. He had not spoken more than a handful of words to anyone in 2 years. His voice was a rusty, unused thing. But the silence inside him had just been broken. He took a step forward, the sound of his boot heel on the dusty ground sharp and definitive. The crowd shifted, their attention turning to him. He was a known quantity, a figure of silent grief, not a man of action. They didn't know what to make of this sudden movement. He didn't look at the Reverend. He looked only at the woman. Her eyes, wide and dark, met his for a fleeting second. In them he saw not wickedness, but a terror so profound it stole the air from his own lungs. He walked past the preacher, his presence a silent rebuke, and stopped directly in front of her. He didn't speak. He simply stood between her and the crowd, his broad back a sudden, unexpected shield. The murmuring died down, replaced by a confused, watchful silence. Reverend Blackwood, his tirade interrupted, sputtered, "Thorn? Step aside. This is a matter of moral hygiene." Elias didn't turn. He remained facing the woman, his gaze steady. He saw the faintest tremor in her chin, the way she clutched her satchel so tightly her knuckles were white. He had sent for a woman named Annabelle. This was not her. He knew nothing about her, not her name, not her story, not the meaning of the brand on her wrist. He knew only what he saw, a human being being hunted. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he spoke. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together, unused and deep. "She's with me," he said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a thunderclap in the still air. He reached out, not to touch her, but a slow, deliberate gesture of offering, his calloused palm turned upward. It was a question and a promise all in one. The Reverend scoffed. "With you? Thorn, have you lost your senses? This woman is—" "She's with me," Elias repeated, his voice harder this time, a low growl of warning. He did not take his eyes off the woman. A single tear traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. For a long moment she stared at his outstretched hand, at the lifeline offered in the midst of a maelstrom. Then, with a slow, hesitant movement, she took a slow circle of safety he had created. The journey back to Blackstone Ridge was a study in silence. The woman, whose name he still did not know, sat beside him on the wagon seat, rigid and small. She kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, as if looking back at the town of redemption was a risk she could not afford to take. Elias didn't press her for words. He understood that some wounds were too fresh for the salt of questions. The silence between them was not empty. It was thick with the unspoken, with the violent scene in the town, with the weight of his sudden, impulsive decision. He could feel her fear radiating from her like heat from a stone. He drove the horses at a steady pace. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels and the soft snort of the animals, the only sounds in the vast, open expanse. The sun began its slow descent, softening the harsh lines of the landscape, bathing the world in a gentle, golden light. He stole glances at her. He saw the fine tremor in her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. He saw the exhaustion etched into the delicate skin around her eyes. Whatever horrors she had fled, they had chased her a long way. He wasn't a savior, he knew that. He was just a man who had recognized a reflection of his own profound isolation in the eyes of a stranger. In protecting her, he had, for the first time in a long time, acted not out of memory or grief, but out of a living, present impulse. It was a strange, unsettling feeling, like a limb that had long been numb, slowly, painfully, beginning to wake up. The world had been gray for so long, a landscape of ash. Now, a single, terrifying speck of color had appeared on the horizon. As they crested the final ridge and his homestead came into view, a lone cabin and barn huddled against the vast emptiness, he felt a pang of something akin to shame. What sanctuary could this place of ghosts offer her? It was a monument to loss, every floorboard creaking with the memory of what was gone. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the world was painted in the bruised colors of twilight. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine and dry earth. He pulled the wagon to a halt near the porch and set the brake. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence deepened, pressing in on them. "We're here," he said, his voice quiet in the growing dusk. She finally turned her head and looked at the cabin. He couldn't read her expression. Was it fear, disappointment, relief? He climbed down from the wagon, his limbs stiff from the long ride. He walked around to her side and looked up at her. He didn't offer a hand, not wanting to presume, not wanting to frighten her. He simply waited. After a moment, she slid down from the seat, her movements graceful despite her exhaustion. She stood on the ground, clutching her satchel, and looked at the small, lonely house that was to be her refuge. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself as if expecting a blow. He knew then that this kindness, this simple act of bringing her here was not enough. The wounds she carried were not visible, and the safety he offered was fragile, easily broken. The real work, the slow, patient work of building trust had only just begun. It would be a structure built not with words, but with quiet gestures, with shared silence, with the careful, painstaking process of two broken souls learning to occupy the same space without shattering each other. He led her inside. The cabin was dark, smelling of wood smoke, leather, and loneliness. He lit a single oil lamp on the main table, and the small flame pushed back the shadows, revealing a room that was starkly clean and meticulously ordered. A stone hearth dominated one wall, cold and black. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center. Everything was functional, stripped of any ornament or comfort. It was the living space of a man who had forgotten how to live, who merely existed. He gestured towards a closed door. "This room is yours," he said. "Yours meekly." He didn't wait for a reply, but went to the hearth, his back to her, and began to build a fire. The scrape of flint on steel was loud in the quiet room. He worked with a familiar, practiced efficiency, laying the kindling and logs with a steady hand. He was more comfortable with this, with the simple physical task of creating warmth and light, than he was with the complex, unpredictable presence of another person in his home. He could hear her take a hesitant step, then another, the soft creak of the door to the spare room opening, then closing. He was alone again, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was occupied, charged with the presence of the unknown woman in the next room. He laid the fire, but he did not light it yet. He stood and went to the pantry, a small nook stocked with flour, beans, and salted meat. He took down a slab of bacon and some potatoes. He began to prepare a meal, his movements sure and steady. The rhythmic thump of the knife on the cutting board was a comforting sound, a return to the familiar routines that had kept him sane. He was a man who communicated through action, and this was his first sentence to her. "You are a guest in my home. You will be fed. You are safe here." He cooked in silence, the hiss and spit of the bacon in the cast-iron skillet the only conversation. The smell of frying meat and potatoes filled the small cabin, a scent of simple, honest sustenance. When the food was ready, he dished it onto 2 tin plates. He set one at his usual spot at the table and the other at the opposite end. He poured 2 cups of water from the bucket by the door. Then he waited, unsure of the protocol for this strange new reality. Should he knock? Call her name, though he did not know it? He felt a profound awkwardness, a social rust that had accumulated over years of solitude. He decided to wait. He sat at the table and stared at his plate, the steam rising in a soft plume. Minutes stretched by. The food was getting cold. He wondered if she was too frightened to come out, if his clumsy attempt at hospitality had been a failure. He was about to give up, to eat his own meal in the familiar quiet, when the door to her room creaked open again. She stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the deeper darkness of the room behind her. "Yes." She looked from him to the plate of food on the table. He didn't speak, didn't move, afraid any sudden gesture would send her retreating back into her shell. Slowly, as if testing the ground before her, she walked to the table and sat down in the chair he had set for her. She kept her eyes downcast, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't touch the food. They sat in silence, the space between them a vast canyon. He finally picked up his fork and began to eat, his movements slow, deliberate. He hoped his own action would serve as an invitation. After a moment, he saw her hand move, her slender fingers hesitantly picking up her own fork. She took a small, tentative bite, then another. They ate the entire meal without a single word or a single glance passing between them. It was the most strangely intimate act he had experienced in years. The days that followed settled into a quiet, watchful rhythm. A new kind of silence fell over the homestead, one that was not empty, but shared. Elias would rise before dawn, as he always had, and find coffee already made, a pot left warming on the edge of the stove. He would drink it in the pre-dawn gray. And when he left the cabin to do his chores, he would leave a plate of bread and jerky on the table for her. He rarely saw her. She was a ghost in his house, a whisper of movement at the edge of his perception. He would catch glimpses of her through the window, a fleeting shape moving from one room to another. She spent most of her time in her room, the door always closed. But small things began to change. One afternoon he came in from the fields, weary and covered in dust, and found one of his work shirts, torn at the elbow, lying on his cot. But it was no longer torn. A line of impossibly neat, small stitches had repaired the fabric, a silent act of mending that spoke volumes. He picked up the shirt, his rough fingers tracing the delicate thread. It was a communication, a fragile thread spun across the chasm of their silence. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. It was gratitude. The next day, he left a small bowl of wild berries he had picked by the creek on the table beside her usual plate. When he returned that evening, the bowl was empty. This became their language. Actions were their words, gestures their sentences. He would leave a bit of wood for the stove inside the door. She would make sure the water bucket was always full from the pump. It was a slow, tentative dance of 2 people learning the shape of each other's presence, building a fragile trust, one small, unspoken kindness at a time. He began to notice her more, not as a symbol of the world's cruelty, but as a person. One morning he saw her through the window, standing by the small vegetable patch he had long neglected, the one where his wife, Sarah, had once grown tomatoes and squash. The earth was dry and cracked, choked with weeds. The woman, whose name was still a mystery to him, was just looking at it, her head tilted. He watched as she knelt down and pulled a single, stubborn weed from the soil. She held it in her hand for a moment before dropping it to the side. It was a small, hopeful gesture, an act of faith in a dead piece of ground. Another day he was trying to gentle a young filly that had been spooked by a snake. The horse was wild-eyed and trembling, jerking away from his touch. He was losing his patience, his own frustration making the animal more agitated. Suddenly, he sensed her presence. She was standing at the edge of the corral, perfectly still. She didn't say a word, but her stillness had a calming effect. She began to hum, a low melodic sound, a tune he had never heard before. The filly's ears twitched. Its panicked breathing began to slow. The woman slowly walked to the fence, still humming, and held out her hand, not to the horse, but just resting it on the top rail. The filly watched her, its wild eyes softening. After a few long moments, the horse took a hesitant step towards her, then another. It stretched out its neck and nudged her hand gently with its nose. Elias stood frozen, watching in disbelief. He had been trying to force the animal into submission. She had soothed it with a song. He was seeing the first glimpses of the strength hidden beneath her fragile exterior, a quiet power he was only beginning to comprehend. Her resilience was a quiet, stubborn thing, like a wildflower pushing its way through a crack in a rock. She began to spend more time outside her room. He would find her sweeping the porch, her movements methodical and serene, or sitting in the shade of the lone cottonwood tree, mending her torn dress with the needle and thread he had left on the table for her. The house began to feel less like a tomb and more like a home. The air was still quiet, but it was a living quiet now, filled with the soft sounds of her presence. The ghosts of his past were still there, but their voices seemed fainter, their edges blurred by this new reality. She began to tend to the neglected garden patch. Every day she would spend an hour or two pulling weeds, turning the soil with a small hand spade she had found in the barn. She worked with the same patient, deliberate care she applied to everything. Elias watched her from a distance, a strange mix of emotions churning inside him. The garden had been Sarah's. After the fire, he had let it go to ruin, unable to bear the sight of it, a vibrant reminder of all he had lost. Now this stranger was bringing it back to life, and he found he didn't mind. It felt less like an intrusion and more like a cleansing. He saw her one afternoon, on her knees in the dirt, her face smudged with earth, and he felt the first real crack in the armor of his grief. He walked over to the well, drew a fresh bucket of water, and carried it over to her, setting it down on the ground beside her without a word. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she didn't immediately look away. Her eyes, the color of a forest floor, held his for a moment. And then she gave him a small, hesitant smile. It was a fragile thing, but it was as bright and as promising as the first green shoot in her newly tilled earth. The first time she spoke, the sound of her voice startled him. It was late, and a summer storm was gathering on the horizon, the air thick and heavy with the smell of rain. He was sitting at the table, cleaning his rifle, the metallic clicks the only sound in the room. She was mending by the light of the lamp, her needle moving in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. "The sky is angry tonight," she said. Her voice was soft, lower than he had imagined, with a slight, unplaceable accent. It was like the rustle of dry leaves, fragile but distinct. Elias froze, his hand still on the rifle. He looked up at her. She was still focused on her sewing, as if she had not just shattered weeks of silence with 5 simple words. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "It'll pass," he managed to say, his own voice sounding loud and clumsy in comparison. She nodded, and a comfortable quiet fell between them again. But it was different. A barrier had been breached. The storm broke soon after, the wind howling around the small cabin, rattling the windows in their frames. Rain lashed against the roof in a furious torrent. With the storm came the memories, as they always did, the smell of smoke, the roar of the flames, the terrifying, all-consuming power of nature's rage. He felt the old panic rising in his chest, a cold sweat on his brow. The rifle felt heavy and useless in his hands. He was back there, in the fire, helpless, watching his world burn. He must have made a sound, a choked gasp, because when he looked up she was watching him, her sewing forgotten, in her lap. Her eyes were filled not with fear of the storm, but with a profound, knowing empathy. She had seen this look before. She recognized the shape of his haunting. She stood up and walked to the hearth, where the fire was burning low. She added a log, her movements calm and steady, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging outside and inside him. The new log caught, and the flames leaped up, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. She didn't speak, but her action was a clear message. "See? Fire can be warmth, it can be a comfort. It does not always have to be destruction." He watched her, his breathing still ragged. The panic began to recede, chased back by the simple, steady presence of this quiet woman. "You go." She had seen his weakness, his terror, and she had not flinched or turned away. Instead, she had met his darkness with a small act of light. She returned to her chair, but she did not pick up her sewing. She simply sat, a silent sentinel, her presence a quiet anchor in his storm-tossed mind. The worst of the tempest passed, the rain softening to a steady drumbeat on the roof. The silence in the cabin returned, but it was deeper now, more resonant. It was the silence of shared vulnerability. After a long time he found his voice again, though it was little more than a whisper. "The fire," he said, the words tasting like ash. "It took my wife, Sarah, and my little girl, Lily." He hadn't said their names aloud in 2 years. Saying them now felt like tearing open a wound, but it also felt like letting in the air. She didn't offer empty platitudes or condolences. She simply nodded, her gaze full of a sorrow that seemed to understand his own. It was in that moment, in the aftermath of the storm, that he knew he was no longer just sheltering a stranger. He was sharing his life, his grief, with a woman who understood the language of loss. He found the locket a few days later. He had gone into her room to fix a sticking window latch while she was outside in the garden. He tried not to look around, to respect her privacy. But his eyes fell on the small silver object sitting on the simple wooden crate she used as a nightstand. It was tarnished and dented, clearly old and cherished. He felt a pang of guilt for his intrusion, but a stronger curiosity compelled him. He picked it up. It was cool and heavy in his palm. With a thumbnail he carefully prized it open. Inside there were no portraits of a loving family, no miniature of a handsome beau. Instead, on one side, a tiny, withered flower was pressed under the glass. On the other, a single name was delicately engraved in a flowing script he barely recognized. Lena. Not Annabelle, Lena. A name as soft and quiet as she was. He closed the locket and placed it back exactly where he had found it, his heart pounding. The lie was there, cold and silver in his hand. The woman from the letter agency, the pious Annabelle, had never existed. He was living with an imposter, a woman with a secret past and a false name. He felt a surge of, what? Anger? Betrayal? He wasn't sure. He left the room. The image of the name, Lena, burned into his mind. He watched her from the doorway as she worked in the garden, her back to him, her hands gentle in the earth. Who was she? What horrors had she endured that would force her to steal another woman's identity to escape? The brand on her wrist, the reverend's accusations, her profound silence. It all began to coalesce into a story far darker than he had imagined. But as he watched her coaxing life from the dead soil, he found that the anger he expected to feel was absent. In its place was a deep, aching protectiveness, a fierce desire to shield this fragile, resilient woman from whatever demons pursued her. That evening, the air between them was tense. He knew her secret, and she seemed to sense the shift in him, the new weight in his silence. She was quieter than usual, her movements more tentative. After their silent meal, as he was banking the fire for the night, she spoke. "My name is not Annabelle," she said to his back. He stopped, his hand hovering over the embers. He turned slowly to face her. She was standing by the table, her hands clasped before her, her knuckles white. She looked terrified, but resolute. "My name is Lena," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I'm sorry I deceived you. The letter, it was the only way I could think of to get away." He just looked at her, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He waited for her to continue, giving her the space to finally tell her story. "The man the Reverend spoke of, he was not a lover. He was my husband. His name is Silas. He is not a kind man." The understatement hung in the air, heavy with unspoken violence. "The brand on my wrist, he put it there. He said it was so everyone would know I belonged to him." Her voice broke on the last words. "I was his property, no more than the cattle in his field. When I couldn't give him a child, he said I was cursed, broken. He locked me away. The town, they believed him. They always believe the powerful." She took a ragged breath. "I heard about the letter agency from a traveling peddler. I stole the letter meant for you. I ran. I thought if I could get far enough away, start a new life, but he will not stop looking for me. Men like him never do." She finally looked up, her eyes swimming with tears, braced for his judgment, for his anger, for him to cast her out just as everyone else had. Elias listened, his face impassive, but inside him a slow, cold rage was building. It was a rage directed not at her, but at the man named Silas, at the town of redemption, at a world that could be so cruel. He looked at Lena, at this small, brave woman who had endured so much, and he felt a surge of fierce, unwavering loyalty. Her deception was not a sin. It was an act of survival. Her lie was more honest than the town's piety. He walked over to where she stood, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. She flinched as he approached, a lifetime of fear conditioned into her reflexes. He stopped a few feet from her. "You have nothing to be sorry for," he said, his voice low and certain. "This is your home now. No one will take you from it." His words were a vow, a declaration of allegiance spoken into the quiet of the lamplit cabin. A single tear spilled over and ran down her cheek, but this time it was not a tear of fear or shame. It was a tear of relief, of a hope she had not dared to feel. For the first time since she had arrived, he saw the crushing weight of her past lift slightly from her shoulders. The fragile trust they had built with silent gestures and shared meals had just been forged into something stronger, something tempered by truth and cemented by his promise. They were no longer just a man and a woman sharing a roof. They were allies, bound together against the darkness that threatened to encroach upon their small circle of light. The secret was out, but instead of breaking them apart, it had drawn them irrevocably together. The outside world did not forget them. A week later, a rider appeared on the ridge, kicking up a plume of dust that signaled the intrusion. It was Reverend Blackwood, his face a thundercloud of righteous indignation. He rode right up to the cabin, his presence an immediate violation of the peace they had built. Elias met him on the porch, positioning himself squarely in the doorway, a silent barrier. Lena was inside, out of sight, but he could feel her presence, a tense stillness behind him. "Thorn," the Reverend began without preamble, his voice dripping with condescension, "I have come to appeal to your sense of decency, though I fear it may be long buried. The town is talking. You are harboring a sinner, a branded woman of ill repute. You shame yourself and this community by keeping her here." Elias's hands curled into fists at his sides. He said nothing, his silence a wall of defiance. "She is a corrupting influence," Blackwood pressed on, his voice rising. "You must cast her out. Send her away before she brings God's wrath down upon this house. It is your Christian duty." Elias looked at the man, at his clean clothes and his soft hands, and he saw the rot beneath the piety. He saw a man who fed on the weakness of others, who used faith as a bludgeon. "This is my house, Reverend," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet, "and she is under my protection. God's wrath doesn't worry me half as much as man's cruelty." The Reverend's face flushed with anger. "You are a fool, Thorn, a damned fool consorting with filth. You will regret this. The good people of redemption will not stand for it." He spat on the ground near Elias's feet, a gesture of ultimate contempt. "You have made your choice. You have chosen to side with sin. Do not come to us when it consumes you." With that, he wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a trail of dust and impotent fury in his wake. Elias stood on the porch until the rider was a mere speck on the horizon, his jaw set like granite. The first shot had been fired. His defense of her had changed everything. When he turned and went back inside the cabin, the air was different. The last barrier between them, the question of his allegiance, had been demolished. Lena was standing by the hearth, her hands pressed to her cheeks, her eyes wide. She had heard everything. She looked at him with an expression of awe and disbelief, as if she had never had anyone stand up for her before. "You shouldn't have," she whispered, though her eyes shone with gratitude. "You've made an enemy of them for my sake." He walked towards her, and for the first time he reached out and gently took her by the arms. Her skin was warm beneath his calloused hands. He looked down at her, his gaze steady and serious. "Their opinion means less to me than the dust on my boots," he said. "This is our place, Lena. Ours." He said the word ours, and it felt right. It felt true. It was no longer his homestead and her refuge. It was their home. In that moment, something shifted from protection to possession, not in the way Silas had branded her, but in a shared sense of belonging. This land, this house, this life. It belonged to both of them now. She leaned into his touch, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, a final surrender of her fear of him. He could feel the slightness of her frame, the deep well of strength within it. He had spent years building walls around his heart, stone by stone, to keep the grief contained. Now this quiet woman had, with her resilience and gentle spirit, found a way inside. She had not torn the walls down, she had simply planted a garden at their base, and the roots were slowly, inexorably, breaking the stones apart. He knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would protect her, not just from the world, but for himself. He would not lose this. He would not let another fire take what he had come to cherish. The threat from the town was one thing, the threat from her past was another. It arrived a few days later, not with the self-righteous pomp of the reverend, but with the quiet menace of a predator. Elias was in the barn, sharpening an axe, when a shadow fell across the wide doorway. He looked up, his hand tightening on the axe handle. A man stood there, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. He was tall and broad, dressed in clothes that were too fine for the frontier, a dark coat and a flat-brimmed hat. He had a cruel, handsome face and eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. Elias didn't need to be told who it was. This was Silas. "I'm looking for my wife," the man said, his voice smooth and cultured, a chilling contrast to his predatory stillness. "A small, dark-haired thing, answers to the name Lena. I was told she might have ended up here with the local hermit." He took a step into the barn, his gaze sweeping over the interior, dismissing it, and Elias, with a faint, contemptuous smile. Elias rose to his full height, the axe held loosely at his side. He was a man of the earth, weathered and hard. Silas was a man of ownership, polished and rotten. The two of them were natural enemies. "There's no one here by that name," Elias said, his voice flat and even. Silas's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's not play games, rancher. I know she's here. I have a legal claim on her. She is my property, and I've come to collect what's mine. Now, you can step aside and let me take her, or I can be persuasive." He opened his coat slightly, revealing the butt of a pistol tucked into his waistband. The threat was clear, delivered with the casual arrogance of a man who was used to getting his own way through violence and intimidation. Elias did not flinch. He just stood there, a mountain of quiet resolve, the sharpened axe in his hand a silent promise of the fight to come. The standoff in the barn was a silent battle of wills. Silas was a man accustomed to bluster and threats, to seeing others crumble before his power. Elias was a man who had nothing left to lose but this one newfound thing, and he would not be moved by words. "She is not property," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "And you're not setting foot inside that house." Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Ever the romantic. Protecting the honor of a runaway whore. Do you even know what she is? What she did? She shamed me. She shamed my name. She requires correction." The way he said the word correction sent a chill down Elias's spine. He could only imagine the horrors Lena had endured at this man's hands. "Whatever she did," Elias said, "she did it to survive you. Now get off my land." Silas's face hardened, the mask of civility dropping away to reveal the raw ugliness beneath. "This is not over, rancher. I'll be back, and when I come, I'll burn this pathetic little hovel to the ground with both of you in it." He turned and walked away, his stride full of arrogant confidence. He was a man who enjoyed the hunt, who savored the fear he inspired. Elias watched him go, his heart pounding with a mixture of rage and dread. He knew Silas meant it. The man's eyes held the casual cruelty of someone who destroyed things for sport. He had threatened fire. He had unknowingly spoken aloud Elias's deepest, most primal fear. The confrontation was no longer a matter of if, but when. He went back to the cabin, the axe still in his hand. Lena was waiting, her face pale. She had seen Silas from the window. "He found me," she whispered, her voice filled with a hopeless terror. Elias went to her and took her hand. It was cold as ice. "He found us," he corrected her gently, "and we'll be ready for him." They prepared for a siege. The peace of the homestead was replaced by a tense, watchful vigilance. Elias cleaned and oiled his rifle and his pistol, his movements precise and deadly. He boarded up the smaller windows of the cabin, leaving only narrow slits to see and shoot through. He brought extra water from the well and stacked firewood inside. Lena worked alongside him, her fear tempered by a new, steely resolve. She was no longer the frightened, silent woman who had arrived weeks ago. She was a survivor, and she was not going to be taken back into the darkness. She gathered stones, sharpened stakes, and helped him set up a simple but effective perimeter alarm using tin cans and twine. They worked together in a seamless, unspoken partnership, their shared purpose binding them closer than any words ever could. As night fell, the homestead felt like a fortress, a small island of defiance against the coming tide. They sat at the table, the lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick with anticipation. "I'm not afraid to die," Lena said quietly into the darkness. "I am only afraid of being his again." Elias reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Neither of those things is going to happen," he said, his voice a raw promise. He looked at her, at the strength and courage in her eyes, and a powerful emotion surged through him, so potent it almost took his breath away. It was love, a fierce, protective, desperate love. He had thought his heart had turned to ash long ago, but he was wrong. It had been sleeping, and this woman had awakened it. He would not let the fire take this one. He would stand in its path. He would become the flame himself if he had to. The attack came just before dawn, in the gray, liminal hour between night and day. It didn't start with a shout or a gunshot, but with a smell. The acrid, unmistakable scent of smoke. Elias was awake instantly, his senses screaming. He looked out the narrow slit of a window, and his blood ran cold. The barn was on fire. Flames licked up the dry wood, a hungry, roaring beast against the pale dawn sky. Silas had kept his promise. He was trying to burn them out, to recreate the very horror that haunted Elias's soul. "He's here," Elias said, his voice grim. Lena was already at his side, her face pale but her eyes clear. The past was literally coming back to consume them. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up Elias's throat, but he pushed it down. He would not be that helpless man again. He grabbed his rifle. "Stay here. Bar the door behind me," he ordered. "No," Lena said, her voice firm. She held up a heavy cast-iron skillet, her knuckles white. "We do this together." He looked at her, at the fierce determination on her face, and saw not a liability but an ally, a partner. He nodded, a flicker of a grim smile on his lips. He unbarred the door, and they stepped out into the fiery chaos. The heat from the burning barn was intense, the roar of the flames deafening. Silas was waiting for them, a shadowy figure near the corral, a pistol in his hand, his face lit by the hellish glow of the fire. "I told you I'd be back, harlot," he screamed over the inferno. "And I told you to get off my land," Elias yelled back, raising his rifle. The world narrowed to the space between them, a battlefield illuminated by the ghosts of Elias's past and the promise of their future. Silas fired first, the shot going wide, splintering the wood of the porch near Elias's head. Elias returned fire, not aiming to kill, but to drive him back, to pin him down. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, a familiar solid kick. While Silas was distracted, Lena moved. She was not a warrior, but she was clever. She darted to the side, keeping low, using the shadows and the chaos as cover. She circled around towards the woodpile, the heavy skillet held like a shield. Elias saw her movement and laid down covering fire, forcing Silas to duck behind the water trough. The fire roared, casting shifting, monstrous shadows. It was a vision from his nightmares, but this time he was not paralyzed. He was fighting. He was protecting. Silas, enraged, rose from behind the trough and charged, firing wildly. Elias took aim, but a burning ember from the barn roof fell and landed on his arm, the sudden searing pain causing his shot to go astray. Silas closed the distance, his face a mask of insane fury, raising his pistol to finish Elias. In that split second, Lena acted. She burst from the shadows behind Silas and swung the heavy iron skillet with all her might. The pan connected with the back of Silas's head with a sickening thud. He grunted, his eyes wide with surprise, and crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle and roar of the burning barn. Ilanus rushed to her side, his arm throbbing. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice raw with concern. She was trembling, breathing heavily, but she nodded. "I am now," she said, looking down at the man on the ground, then at the fire. They had faced the demon from her past and the ghost from his, and together they had won. They didn't kill Silas. They tied him up, and when the sun was fully risen, Elias slung his unconscious form over his horse and rode into redemption. He didn't stop at the Reverend's church. He went straight to the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a weary, pragmatic man, listened to the story, looked at the brand on Lena's wrist, at the burn on Elias's arm, and at the still unconscious man on the floor. He'd heard whispers of Silas's cruelty before. By noon, Silas was in a cell, and a telegraph was on its way to a federal marshal in the next territory. Elias rode home, the smoke from his smoldering barn a dark plume against the blue sky. When he arrived, Lena was waiting for him on the porch. She had a bucket of water and a clean cloth and began to tend to the burn on his arm, her touch gentle and sure. They didn't speak of what had happened. There was no need. The shared danger, the fight for their lives, had burned away any remaining doubt or hesitation. It had forged their bond into something unbreakable. The barn was a ruin of blackened timbers, a stark monument to the battle they had fought. It was a loss, but it was not a tragedy. It was a sacrifice. The fire had come again, but this time it had not taken anything he couldn't live without. This time it had cleansed. It had burned away the last vestiges of the past, leaving behind a clean, clear space for a new future to be built. He watched her as she carefully bandaged his arm, her dark hair falling across her face. He reached out and gently brushed it back, his fingers lingering on her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. The war was over. The peace could begin. In the months that followed, they rebuilt. They did not rebuild the barn in the same place. They chose a new spot on higher ground, and they built it together, beam by beam. The work was hard, but it was a good kind of hard. It was the work of creating, not just mending. The rhythm of their life found a new, deeper cadence. The silence between them was no longer a space of caution, but one of deep, comfortable understanding. It was a silence rich with shared glances, small smiles, and the easy comfort of two people who knew each other's hearts without the need for constant words. The garden Lena had started thrived. It became an oasis of green in the harsh landscape, producing tomatoes, squash, and beans. The act of nurturing the soil seemed to nurture her own soul, and the life springing from the earth was a symbol of the new life they were building. The townsfolk left them alone. The story of Silas in the fire had spread, casting a new light on the branded woman and the stoic rancher who had defended her. Reverend Blackwood fell silent, his moral authority diminished by the stark reality of true evil and true courage. Elias and Lena found their world had shrunk to the boundaries of their land, and they discovered it was all the world they needed. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over their new barn and thriving garden, Elias turned to Lena as they sat on the porch. "Marry me," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a simple, profound truth. She didn't answer with words. She simply took his calloused, scarred hand in her own and held it tight, her answer clear in the warmth of her touch. The resolution was not a grand celebration, but a quiet, profound peace. It was found in the small, everyday moments. It was in the way he would watch her moving about the cabin, her presence, a soft, steady light that had banished all the ghosts. It was in the way she would look up from her work and smile at him, a smile that reached her eyes and spoke of a happiness she had never known. Their love was not a fiery, passionate thing. It was a deep, slow-growing root, stubborn and strong, anchored in the shared soil of their past sorrows and their present joy. It was the love of two people who had been broken by the world and had found a way to piece each other back together. The final scene of their struggle was not a climax of action, but one of quiet domesticity. On a cool autumn morning, Elias stood by the corral, watching Lena hang laundry on a line strung between the cabin and a cottonwood tree. A gentle breeze caught the white sheets, making them billow like the sails of a ship setting out on a calm sea. She turned and saw him watching, and a slow, radiant smile spread across her face. He smiled back, a real, unburdened smile that reached his eyes and erased the last of the hard lines of grief. The land around them was still harsh, the wind still blew, but it no longer felt lonely. It felt like home. The silence was no longer empty, it was full. It was filled with a promise of tomorrow, with the steady beat of two hearts that had found their rhythm together. A quiet, hopeful music in the vast, wild expanse of the West. The cycle was complete. The sanctuary had become a home. The silence had become a language, and the two solitary souls had become a family. The final image was one of peace, of harmony with the land, and of a love that was as resilient and as enduring as the mountains on the horizon. This story, born from the dust and desperation of the Wild West, is a testament to the quiet strength of the human heart. It shows how two broken souls, cast out and haunted by their pasts, can find redemption not in grand gestures, but in the small, patient acts of kindness and trust. Elias and Lena's journey reminds us that sanctuary can be built in the most isolated of places, and that love can grow in the most barren soil. Their slow-burn romance, forged in silence and sealed in a moment of shared peril, celebrates the power of endurance and the profound peace that comes from finding the one person who sees you, protects you, and chooses you, no matter the cost. It is a story of grit and grace, of the harshness of the world juxtaposed with the tenderness of a connection that heals all wounds. If you were moved by their struggle and inspired by their quiet victory, we invite you to become part of our community. Their story is one of many we share, tales designed to explore the depths of the human experience and find hope in the darkness. Subscribe to our channel for more poetic, inspirational short films that celebrate the enduring power of love and the resilience of the human spirit. Join us, and let these stories remind you that, even after the fiercest fire, new life can and will begin to grow.